All right, welcome to Cyber Judio. We're going to continue to study Microsoft Windows security as we endeavor to be prepared for our Cyber Patriot competition. So this will be the Windows file protections. We'll learn about how to do Windows file security. We'll go through that a bit in the slide deck here. And then we'll flip over to our virtual environment. We'll look at a kind of live fire situation with doing some Windows file protections, give everyone some examples, get this concept down. And that will conclude our Windows content. And then we can move on and begin the Linux content and the Cisco networking, both of which really good. Excited about getting into the Linux and the Cisco. Okay, so let's talk about Windows file protections. So our first slide, our little intro, and of course they're always going to take us back to that CIA triad. Cyber Patriot emphasizes the CIA triad a lot. We see it pop up just about every other slide deck, it seems like. But it is important. Certification test that I'm studying right now, the CISSP, it hits on that, relates it to this acronym and these three concepts. So it is very important. Just for review, C is for confidentiality. Only the approved users have access to data, not someone who shouldn't be in there. That's the confidentiality. The integrity, assurance that information has not been tampered with or corrupted between the source and the end user. It's the data integrity. The source integrity, assurance that the sender of the information is who it is supposed to be. And that's a little bit of a riff on that, because usually that assurance bit is actually something you pull off, and that's a different element separate from the CIA triad. Usually it's more that first part, the data integrity, and then the assurance that the person who sent that is the one you intended, not, for example, some sort of a spam or something like that. That's usually a separate piece from it. So confidentiality, integrity, and then of course availability, ensuring that data is accessible by approved users when needed. All right, so good review there, and let's talk about file permissions. So with file permissions, we're talking about the Windows environment, of course, and with file permissions, we're not going to go into a server environment, go into our computer, and start just giving anyone access to any folder or any file. That could vary a lot with what the person's role is, what kind of data one department, one group, one team needs to see versus another. You get into confidential data, you get into payment stuff, legal stuff, things that could be sensitive or damaging if they're released the wrong way. So you need to go in and say this user has access to this set of data, but a different user group has access to another data set. Then you have to be specific about, well, should a user be able to only read it, or should they also be able to change it? And then there's the whole administrators group. So let's talk about each of those roles and capabilities just a bit. So it's an important tool for ensuring data integrity and confidentiality. Integrity, making sure the data doesn't get modified in an undesirable way. And confidential, only the people that are supposed to have access have access. Does not get into the A, the availability. That one's not covered under the file permissions, but the two are. More customizable than blanket permissions. They're kind of talking about old school when you had users or administrators and groups essentially where you gave permissions to one or the other. Either the users had it who could change anything, or the administrators who had full control, including be able to set the permissions for which group could or could not get access to something. Restrict access to shared resources, that's kind of the point. And it can be customized by individual user or by user group. That group part is important because if you have a large environment, many users, doing individual permissions becomes pretty cumbersome. And then when you have changes, again, very cumbersome. You have a departure or a transfer from one area, group area, one department to another. Pretty cumbersome to go back through all the folders and files that an individual user may have been in. You take groups, and there's actually a more detailed way of going into it beyond the scope of the content here, for how you put a user in a group. Then you give permissions to that group, and if a person leaves or moves, you can just edit the group membership, and it handles it for everything where that group's had that assignment. But there's a formal way Microsoft recommends where there's actually putting user inside one kind of a group, and then that group goes in another, and that group's what gets the permissions. But again, that's probably will be under scope for this. Just knowing that you could do it one way or the other is about all we need at this level. Types of file permissions. So first of all, you can have full control. That's the admins. That's the role we're talking about having at the moment. Being able to actually say who can or cannot have access. That's what your server administrators, your network admins, the kind of thing they do, because someone has to set these permissions to begin with. Modify lets you change the content but not ownership, and you cannot delete it. So an existing file, you could open up a Word document, make some changes and save the changes, but you can't delete it, and you can't say who can and cannot get to it. Read and execute only allows you to run a program. So you wouldn't be able to edit anything, but if there's a program sitting on a network share and it's stored there, read and execute would be the permission set. Listing folder contents is a strange one because it lets you list the file names, but you can't do anything else. So you could open up a folder and see that the files are there and see which files are there, but you can't do anything. You can't open any of the files. You can't run any programs. You can just list it. Pretty awkward. Not many use cases for that I've ever seen, but they do have it. Maybe if you need to check and make sure some reports ran, that might be an example. Operator goes in, checks in the morning that the nightly reports all ran, sees all the files that are supposed to be there, can check off the list and say, yep, that's good. That's about the only use case I've run across or have seen, but pretty seldom used with that list folder content. Write permissions, make changes to a file and overwrite existing content, self-explanatory. And read access, let users read the attributes of a file or folder, but not edit them. So just from a practical standpoint, in having done this stuff for a couple of decades, full control, you see that one used a lot because the administrators need that. The write access, making the changes, that one's a pretty common one. And then the read access for folks that only need to read but not change the content also. Those three see used the most commonly. The others, pretty seldom. Good to know that they're there. All right, so parent and child objects. So we're going to get into this concept of inheritance. What they're showing here, this is just obviously just looking at a folder structure on a local C drive, not even going to a network share. Cyber Patriot doesn't seem to go into the whole network share thing. We'll maybe talk about that offline at some point. So they just use the C drive example. And you've got a finance folder, an IT folder, a legal folder, and you can see how there's this indentation that you have. And so under finance, you have these other three folders that are below it and indented slightly. That's showing that these are subfolders or child objects. And they are folders that exist inside the reports, the client account, the employee expenses. Those are folders that sit inside of finance. So if you were looking at this from your Explorer view, this is where you would maybe double click on the finance and see these three folders. You can go inside those. Notice how, so like leading finance and its child objects, its subfolders, parallel to it, you have human resources. So these are what you would call sibling objects. They sit at the same level. So within human resources, we've got three folders. Another sibling on the same level as finance and HR is the IT. It's got one subfolder, one child object, and then legal the same. So you can see how it's got this tiered structure, this hierarchical view. And that what's important there is there might be times when you want to set permissions on, let's say, this finance folder. And if you do something on the finance folder, it might be handy that instead of having to go in and also change on these three subfolders, on these three child objects, why not the things we said for finance, like say we've got a group of people that are the finance users, we give them access to the finance folder. Conveniently, the default behavior of Windows is to let those same permissions, what we call be inherited, down to these subfolders. Makes it a lot easier on the administrator. Pretty easy assumption that that's going to work like that. But there are ways that you can change it so that, let's say there was something different about employee expenses. You can do what's called break inheritance so it doesn't necessarily flow down, and then you could edit those specifically. So you've got the flexibility there, but to build the behavior and kind of based on what's going to be the most likely case where this inheritance things work. Same thing with the HR. You change permissions on the human resources, these others, it would cascade down to those subgroups. Now, not to one of these sibling level ones. It doesn't work sideways, just down. With IT to the checklist and legal to the copyrights would work the same way, and we'll look at an example here in just a second. So that's the concept. We've got this hierarchy with this child and parent concept, and then you can also they don't mention it here, but you could refer to these as siblings when they're at the same level. So we'll look at some real examples in just a second. Okay, by default, objects in a folder, like this folder that's under the finance folder, objects in a folder, known as child objects, inherit permission settings from their containing folder, known as the parent object. All right, we've already looked at that a little bit. You can turn off inheritable permissions to customize what kind of access to certain folders, subfolders, or documents. Talked about that. You can turn the behavior off if it's what's required. And depending on users and need, how many users need access to a file or folder, or how many of the files in the folder need to be restricted, there's several ways to apply permissions. That's true also. So here they go into a couple of screenshots that show this being used. And so they're showing you go to the folder, they've right-clicked on the folder, they've gone to properties, they click the security tab, they click edit. Edit gives them this box where you can see those same set of permissions we talked about. You can make some changes, you okay that. Those permissions would appear here. And then it would then be inherited in these subfolders as well. Customizing them, they're going to show you an advanced button, which is the same thing that you would have right here at this stage of their process with the screenshot. You click on the advanced, and then you can do this. Include inheritable permissions. So you can uncheck the inheritance and turn that off if you didn't want a subfolder, a child object, to inherit the permissions from its parent folder. And we'll look at that a little bit. So let's look at that just real quick. And we'll minimize here. We'll pull up our VM instance. All right, so we've got something kind of similar. So here's the C drive. And we're looking at the C drive here, and we'll expand it out kind of the same way they did. Let's expand out the users. And under users, we've got Avengers, Batman, Cyber Patriot, Hulk, Justice League, Public Forum, Wonder Woman. All right, so we'll open it up here. It might be a little more easy to see. So we've got the same thing here. Here is an Avengers folder. In the Avengers folder, we right-click, we click Properties, we go to the Security tab where we do the permissions to say who can and can't get to it. And notice we've got Hulk and we've got Thor that have permissions, along with our built-in Cyber Patriot group and the system permission. All right, so that is what is under Avengers. Now, when we open Avengers, here's Infinity War. It's a subfolder. It's a child object. When we do Properties and Security, and notice how everything's grayed out here. That's because it's inherited. We would have to go to, like the example said, Advanced, and disable the inheritance. I'm actually using a different OS version than they had, so the buttons and the behavior's slightly different. Disable inheritance here, and then I could go back and change these permissions, but I have to change them manually from then on unless I turn the inheritance back on again. Okay, so let's do an example. So let's see if we go to Justice League. As you're all very well aware, Wonder Woman and Batman are our two Justice League. So if I go to, in fact, let me back up. If I go to Justice League, and let's check the Justice League permission settings. Right-click Justice League, left-click permissions, go to Security. All right, so let's do this. We've got Batman here, but there's a Wonder Woman user, so let's fix it. So let's do Edit. All right, we're going to change these. I don't see Wonder Woman, so let's add her. And then I just type in the name of the user. I know that I created the Wonder Woman user. I type it in. I click Check Name so I can find it. When it underlines, that's a good thing. I click OK. Now Wonder Woman's there. Let's give her read access, and let's also give her write access, and let's do OK. Now she is here. She's got permissions, and let's OK it. And then let's go to Justice League. And let's look at a subfolder, the Properties and the Security, and notice that now Batman has it, but so does Wonder Woman, because we set her up and she's inheriting this permissions. Same thing on the JL1 folder. We right-click it. We click the Security tab, and there's Wonder Woman also inheriting those. Now, let's do this. Let's do Advanced. Let's do Disable Inheritance. I'm going to convert them to explicit, which means just copy them like they were. Now I can uncheck, and I could do something like Edit and Remove. No, not that one. That would be a bad thing. Edit and Remove Wonder Woman. And now I can change those discreetly or directly. So that's a quick overview of the NTFS permissions. More to come in a little bit. We'll see you on the next video.